It may surprise some of you to know that Paul is actually McCartney's middle name. He was born James Paul McCartney on the 18th of June 1942 at Walton General Hospital in Liverpool. His mother, Mary, had trained as a nurse at that hospital before becoming a midwife after the birth of their second son, Michael, in 1944, and was more or less the primary wage earner for the family. Like many Scousers, the McCartney family were of Irish descent, and both boys were baptised in their mother's Catholic faith. Their father, Jim McCartney, had worked in the cotton trade before the war, where he was a volunteer firefighter, before he returned to the trade in 1946. But Jim's biggest passion had always been music. He had learned to play the trumpet and piano by ear, and had created the Jim Mac Jazz Band in the 1920s with his eldest brother Jack. Jim was the third eldest of 7 children, against his father's wishes, who preferred listening to opera as opposed to the ragtime music his son was playing. This disapproval over music would soon repeat itself. Due to their mother's work, the McCartneys would find themselves moving around a lot, living in the Spick area before finally settling at 20 Forthlin Road in 1955. Despite their mother's Catholic roots, both Paul and Michael attended Protestant schools, starting at Stockton Road Primary School and then transferring to Joseph Williams Primary. Paul naturally was the most studious. His work was impeccable, even his handwriting was admired by his teachers, and when it came to sitting his 11-plus exams, Paul was able to pass enough of them with ease, which meant he was secured a place at the Liverpool Institute, one of the most prestigious grammar schools for boys in England. A stark contrast to his future writing partner, Paul showed no sign of rebellion. He appeared neat and tidy, he was popular amongst his classmates and teachers, he loved reading and studying, though his homework, while still decent, was something he normally just fluffed through. Had Paul kept this up, it's most likely he would have gone on to be a teacher as his mother wished. But sadly, she would never see what he actually became. Mary had been complaining about pains in her chest for some time and had just dismissed it as being due to stress. But as the pains got worse, she finally went to see a specialist, where the one thing she dreaded had happened. Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer, and when she was transferred to hospital for the operation, the cancer had spread so far that there was nothing they could do. Mary McCartney died a few hours later on Halloween 1956. Paul and Michael were sent to live with their auntie Jin so that Jim could grieve in peace. His mother's passing influenced Paul to write his first song called I Lost My Little Girl. Now a widow, Jim was left with the task of raising 2 adolescent boys on his own, but he soon managed to easily slip into both working father and housekeeping roles. One of John Lennon's fondest memories of visiting Paul at his house was having Jim greeting him at the door with his sleeves rolled up and wearing a flowery apron. As you may have guessed, due to Jim's musical abilities, the McCartney home was always filled with music. Jim had bought an upright piano from North End Music Store, or NEMS. In case you're wondering, it is the same store that Brian Epstein would turn into the famous music publishing company, though at this time it was still dealing with musical instruments and being run by Harry Epstein, Brian's father. As Paul and Michael got older, Jim would allow them to listen to Radio Luxembourg, the forerunner of what would be pirate radio, and taught them the importance of harmonizing, which was something Paul appreciated when it came to the Beatles' style of singing. Paul also took up playing the piano, and after Mary's death, Jim had bought Paul a trumpet, but he soon discarded it because, as he said, "How will I be able to sing with this in my mouth?" Another reason for losing the trumpet was that the skiffle fad had started, and Paul was now listening to the rock and roll songs coming in on Radio Luxembourg, like Little Richard, Carl Perkins, and Elvis. This obsession finally resulted in Jim, who had made it clear that he did not want a teddy boy in the family, buying Paul his first acoustic guitar. But for some reason, Paul was struggling to play it, and nearly gave up on that as well, where he tried something out. Even though he was right-handed, playing the guitar that way just didn't feel right. But Paul suggested flipping the strings around and try it left-handed, and when that felt more natural to him, he too became lost to the instrument. After Paul had joined the Quarrymen in 1957, Jim, like his father, showed his distaste in the type of music they played, even though he allowed them to rehearse in the house, and when Paul became closer to John, Jim told him that hanging out with a delinquent like Lennon would get Paul into trouble and damage his future career. And he was kind of right, since around this time Paul's marks in school were starting to drop. He also disapproved of the group going to Hamburg to play, but Paul managed to change his mind when he told him how much they were going to be paid, and since money had always been a problem for them, Jim was open to any kind of income. But as the years went on and the Beatles became more successful, Jim grew to accept the growing admiration for his son's music, though he could still be critical. A classic example being when John and Paul first played him She Loves You, Jim asked them to change the yeah, yeah, yeah to yes, yes, yes because it sounded too American. Then in 1964, Paul bought his father a mock Tudor house called Rembrandt as a retirement present, and so that he could get away from all the fans that came to Forthlin Road on a daily basis. I think now is a good time to talk about the relationship between John and Paul. Since both had lost their mothers in different but tragic circumstances, they felt that they had a special connection between them, and their deaths had affected them in different ways. Julia Lennon's death had made John feel angry and lost, but Mary's death made Paul appreciate life and try to keep a positive attitude, so they were the perfect yin and yang. That would also come across in their songwriting. We know that the songs were credited as Lennon-McCartney, but there's actually very few songs in the Beatles' discography that John and Paul actually wrote together. The normal way was that one of them would have a song idea, and the other would throw ideas for the middle eight, and for the longest time that was why the Lennon-McCartney partnership worked, because either one knew how to balance the other's song. If John's song was becoming too depressing, then Paul would know how to liven it up. And if Paul's song was a bit too sugar-coated, then John could drag it back down into reality. This is what sparked a friendly competition between the two, as each would try to better the other in terms of material and sound. But of course, over time, that friendly competition was not to last. However, Paul would always see John as his best friend, even during their darkest periods. In fact, one of the last ever questions John was answered was on his relationship with Paul, in which he described him as a brother who would do anything for him and he would do the same. I honestly believe that had Paul been with him on that night, he would have proved that statement true.